Hello and welcome to the Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker Bard Guide. My name is Julia and I will be covering the ins and outs of the Bard job at level 90. Bard, alongside Dancer and Machinist, is one of the 3 physical range DPS. The Bard job focuses on providing constant damage buffs to your party through the means of your songs, alongside 2 major damage buffs every 2 minutes. The job cycles through 3 songs, which each slightly adjust its playstyle. The Bard gauge is relatively simple to understand. The first aspect is your song bar. Depending on which song you're currently in, this will display the time remaining and the procs relative to your song. To the side, it shows you your quotas for your Radiant Finale buff, although this can largely be ignored. Lastly, there's your soul voice gauge, which fills up to 100. This gauge fills up by 5 whenever one of your songs proc their corresponding procs. Having more than 20 gauge allows you to use Apex Arrow, and having more than 80 gauge also allows you to use Blast Arrow after this Apex Arrow. Bard's playstyle revolves around rotating 3 songs: Wanderer's Minuet, Army's Peon, and Mage's Ballade. These each provide a party bite buff and adjust your rotation slightly. Wanderer's Minuet provides all party members within 30 yalms with a 2% crit buff and allows the usage of Pitch Perfect. When using this song, you will start stacking up repertoire stacks. These can be spent on Pitch Perfect. Aim to cast Pitch Perfect when you have 3 of these stacks whilst avoid overcapping. Army's Peon provides all party members within 30 yalms with a 3% direct hit buff. The procs during this song decrease your recast time and your auto attack time. Ending this song grants Army's Mute, a buff which keeps the effect going for another 10 seconds. Mage's Ballade grants all party members within 30 yalms a 1% flat damage buff. Repertoire procs during Mage's Ballade reduce the cooldown of Bloodletter and Reign of Death. These 3 songs naturally aren't just as strong as each other. Also, Army's Muse is very valuable during your 2-minute burst. This is why we have a set song cycle. Within your 2-minute rotation, you open with Wanderer's Minuet and use this for 43 seconds. The reason why you don't use its full duration is because it's unable to grant you more repertoire procs and the last 3 seconds of the song. Next up, we enter Mage's Ballade for 34 seconds. This is simply because it's our weakest song. Lastly, we use Army's Peon for the next 43 seconds, and this leads us into the 2-minute mark where we use Wanderer's Minuet again and restart the song cycle. Starting off with your dots. Stormbite and Caustic Bite are both dots you want to keep running at all times. Once applied for the first time, refreshing these dots becomes very easy. Simply use Iron Jaws when their duration is about to expire to fully refresh them both with 1 GCD. Next up, we have Burst Shot. This is your filler ability. Cast this when you have no other GCDs to cast. Refulgent Arrow is a hard-hitting GCD ability that can only be used when you have the buff Straight Shot ready. This buff is granted by Stormbite, Caustic Bite, Burst Shot, Barrage, and Iron Jaws. Bloodletter is an OGC with a very short cooldown. Keep this from overcapping. Imperial Arrow is another OGCD with a short cooldown. This ability grants a guaranteed repertoire proc for your current song. Use this on cooldown. Drifting this ability is a huge loss of damage. Sidewinder is a hard-hitting OGCD with a longer cooldown. Simply use this on cooldown. Next up, we have Apex Arrow. You gain access to this ability when your soul voice gauge hits 20. That said, if you use it with 80 gauge or more, you also gain access to its combo ability Blast Arrow. We treat this ability as a 60-second cooldown. Use it if you have 80 gauge or more when there is 21 seconds left in Mage's Ballade, then hold onto it for your next 2-minute burst, even if this means overcapping. Lastly, we have our 2-minute buffs. Raging Strikes increases our damage done by a flat 15% for 20 seconds. Battle Voice grants all party members within 20 yalms a 20% direct hit buff. Barrage instantly grants you a stack of straight shot ready and triples the potency of the next used weapon skill. Always use this buff on a Revulgent Arrow proc. Radiant Finale grants all party members within 20 yalms a flat damage buff. This damage buff is based on how many songs you've played prior to using this ability. If you keep to the earlier mentioned song cycle, this should always be 6% except for the opener. Since these free abilities have a 2-minute cooldown, we have a set rotation to deal with them, and you can largely forget about them outside of this rotation. Our 2-minute rotation is never exactly the same. This is because Bard's rotation heavily relies on procs from your songs and straight shot. This is why we have a priority system instead of a rotation. Outside of your 2-minute bursts and openers, try to keep up the following priority. For your GCDs, use Stormbite and Casting Bite if your dots are currently not up. Else, use Iron Jaws to refresh your dots if they're about to fall off. Use Revulgent Arrow if straight shot is ready, or use Apex Arrow if you get between 80 and 100 gauge prior to being 21 seconds left in Mage's Ballad, else save it for the next 2-minute burst. Make sure to always follow Apex Arrow up with a combo action, Blast Arrow. Do this within 10 seconds or else the Blast Arrow disappears. And lastly, if there's none of the earlier mentioned GCDs available, fill her up with Burst Shot. For your OGCDs, there's the following priority. Make sure to keep your songs up at all times. Use the song cycle mentioned earlier to decide when and what song to use next. Avoid overcapping on your song procs by using Pitch Perfect 3 and Bloodletter charges before you get more via the timer or Imperial Arrow. Try not to drift your Imperial Arrow. The guaranteed procs this OGCD provides are very valuable and a huge damage loss if missed. Outside of your songs, make sure to use Bloodletter on cooldown and that it does not overcap. Lastly, also use Sidewinder on cooldown. Since your songs and straight shot ready procs will be different from pool to pool, certain aspects of your opener and 2-minute buff windows also change. Try your best to meet the previously mentioned priorities after your buffs go out. Your opener and 2-minute buffs windows are also not the same, so it's important to cover them both separately. That said, this is your opener. Cast Peloton when there's 15 or 10 seconds left on the timer to keep your melees and tanks smiling. Next, pre-paw 1.5 seconds before the pull. Open with Stormbite and weave in Wanderer's Minuet and Raging Strikes. Cast Caustic Bite and use Imperial Arrow and Bloodletter to get the cooldowns rolling before you either Burst Shot or Revulgent Arrow depending on your RNG. Weave in Radiant Finale and Battle Voice before either another Burst Shot or another Revulgent Arrow. If this is a Burst Shot which procs straight shot ready, then weave in Sidewinder and use Revulgent Arrow and then finally Barrage. If this is a Burst Shot and does not proc a Revulgent Arrow, or if you have Revulgent Arrow here already, weave in Barrage into another Revulgent Arrow and finally weave in Sidewinder. After this, try to keep your spells on cooldown and uphold the GCD and OGCD priority list mentioned earlier in the guide. Finally, it's important to use Iron Jaws once all party buffs are applied so your dots snapshot the 2-minute buffs. Do this while avoiding overcapping Pitch Perfect and you got yourself a perfect opener. This opener can feel somewhat stressful, so it's recommended to practice it a few times before continuing into the rotation. Here's an example of the opener. For your 2-minute burst, things are a little bit different. This is because we are entering our burst window with Army's Peon's buff, Army's Muse. This buff keeps the skill speed buff from Peon for an additional 10 seconds after you swap to Wanderer's Minuet. Try to keep your GCD and OGCD priorities as mentioned earlier. Alongside this, there are a few things set in stone. Late weave Wanderer's Minuet into either Burst Shot or Revulsion Arrow. Then use Raging Strikes and Imperial Arrow. Use Burst Shot or Revulsion Arrow twice before weaving Battle Voice and Radiant Finale. Then, when all buffs are up, cast Apex Arrow if you have 80 gauge or higher. Dump all Bloodletter charges and refresh your dots with Iron Jaws. Aside from this, keep your cooldowns and procs from overcapping and aim to spend them all when the buffs are up. For Bard, there's a simple rule. Item level is always better. Yes, even over pentamelted gear. This is because none of the substats are bad enough on Bard to warrant giving up on the extra dexterity item level gives. Our substat priority then is crit over determination over direct hit over skill speed. However, as mentioned, the value of crit, determination and direct hit are very close. For SKS and achieving certain skill speed, Bard likes to be at about 2.48 or a 2.47 recast time. This makes it so you can easily keep your Imperial Arrow on cooldown, which allows it to better line up with your 2-minute bursts. This guide is made with no specific tier in mind, so for your exact BIST list, please visit the Balance Discord or website where you can find an updated best in slot list. These will list the gear you're aiming to obtain. Bard brings also a fair amount of utility, and a good Bard uses them all. The first ability to talk about is Troubadour. This ability has a 90-second cooldown and applies a 15-second buff to all nearby party members that reduces the damage taken by 10%. This is one of the strongest damage mitigations a DPS can bring, as you do not have to target the boss to apply it, and the duration is considerably longer than both Feint and Addle. It is worth to note that both Dancer and Machinist have their own versions of Troubadour. These are named Shield Samba and Tactician. These three abilities are functionally the same and do not stack. Instead, they override each other. Keep this in mind when in a party with another physical range player. Next up, we have Nature's Min. This ability increases HP recovery by healing actions on the target for 15 seconds and by 20%. Throw this onto your main tank during pre-pull and onto the party members that are struggling to stay alive due to dots or debuffs, or most importantly, coordinate usage with your Scholar Healer and their deployment tactics. If you have issues targeting party members, casting the spell and keeping your GCD rolling, then you can macro in specific targets before the pull. Such a macro looks like this, where the number between the brackets is the specific party member. Lastly, we have Warden's Peon. This ability is slightly niche and doesn't see regular usage. When used, it removes one detrimental effect from yourself or targeted party member. You can also precast this to make the next enfeebling spell cast on said target be nullified. Aside from these three abilities, Bard also has access to the physical range job abilities. These include Leg Raise, a 40% slow that lasts for 10 seconds. Second Wind, a potent self-heal with a long cooldown. Use this when caught in a dire situation. Foot Grace, a 10-second long route that disappears when the target takes damage. Peloton, a rate-wide buff that increases everyone's movement speed. This buff does not work inside of combat, so use this buff during the pre-pull to help your melees and tanks get to the boss faster, and use it in between dungeon pulls. Head Grace, an interrupt on a short cooldown. And finally, Arm's Length. This will be your knockback immunity. Lastly, I want to talk about a few smaller notes that I didn't believe fit in any of the previous categories. If you have high ping, you might have issues double weaving. This makes the job perform significantly worse. However, there are ways to deal with this. For PC users, you can use No Clippy or FFXIV Alexander to increase the spell queue window. For both PC users and console users, you can use a VPN to get a better route to the server. possibly reducing your ping that way. For more information, check the balance Discord. XIV analysis is a useful tool to help you analyze your rotation. Simply put in your FF logs report to see what you can improve upon. I recommend using this frequently whilst learning the job.